getting a bit of a focus in this conference on self-determination issues in the Pacific. And in that connection, I want to mention, of course, the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting. There's a very strong connection between the self-determination efforts in the region and the self-determination efforts which are happening here in Australia. A truth-telling commission, the first one ever in Australia, being held in Victoria as part of the efforts of recognising the rights of the traditional owners of Australia over their land. So there's a deep connection between that and what we'll be talking about this morning. So the first of the two large projects on the program this morning is an address by the President of French Polynesia, Mr. Motai Brotherson. And I should say that the reason why we have the President talking is really because a year ago at another conference here in Canberra, Nick McClellan, who's just walked in, told me about this new president in New Caledonia and how he was committed to reaching of self-determination in Polynesia, French Polynesia, working towards a referendum in the 2030s perhaps. And it was that suggestion from Nick that we ought to be looking at what he was doing, which led us to include or to approach President Brotherson, who was very interested from the beginning, late last year when we began to contact him. So thank you, Nick, for the suggestion. Nick's always a great source of advice about what's happening in the French Pacific and a great source of encouragement to the Department of Pacific Affairs to work on those, to give attention to the issues arising there. Nick gives a lecture each year in my course on a course I do with Colin Wiltshire on resource conflicts in the Pacific. He comes, volunteers to assist with a case study of New Caledonia each year. So he's a great source of strength on understanding the region. So President Brotherson's speech arrived late yesterday. We had to choose between a video or a live stream, and we were too nervous to try a live stream from French Polynesia with the connectivity issues. But it turns out that instead of the IT people in his government helping him with his speech, he put it together. And we checked it last night when it arrived, and there's an amazing array of materials presented. I mentioned this to one of his staffers, who wrote back and said, yes, he's a geek. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to President Brotherson, the geek.
Yorana, everyone. Hello, my name is Motai Brotherson. I'm the current president of French Polynesia, Maui Nui, and I'm very happy and honored to be speaking to you during this State of the Pacific 2024 conference. I will be addressing you about our specific journey to self-determination from the ancient times where we were a free country, and then the arrival of the Europeans, first the Brits with Captain Samuel Wallis in 1767, and followed closely by the French, Mr. Bougainville, and then Captain Cook. So at the time, all the, I would say, the big countries from Europe were basically discovering the world, the unknown world, and bringing, I would say, the light to the savages. It was a time where these nations were at the same time doing some military colonization, but also bringing with them Christianity. So it was both a religious and a military colonization. The Brits came with the London Missionary Society, so which is now the Protestant church, the dominant church here in French Polynesia, and the French came with the Catholic Church, which is the second church here in Polynesia. During this time, I would say there was a competition, a fierce competition between the Brits and the French about who was going to take control of our country. And the usual, I would say, blend of diplomacy, military control, military pressure, religious lobbying was used by both sides. This, I would say, and I'm gonna, tell this story short. This bringing us to 1880, where the French annexated our country by, I would say, forcing King Pomaré V and all the chiefs that were still ruling, so to speak, the country at the time, to give up its Tahiti and its dependencies to France. So the first true episode of the loss of our independence is really the signing of this treaty of annexation between by King Pomaré V and all the chiefs that were there. This was the beginning of the era of real colonization to us. The second episode on our journey should have been a happy one. It was the creation of the United Nations on October 24th, 1945. The basic idea behind the creation of the United Nations was for all these big nations to do an analysis of which were the causes that led to World War II and how to avoid in the future World War III. One of these causes that were identified was the existence of those colonial empires that were held by some of the countries that were belligerent. And so those colonial empires, their existence was enticing those colonial powers to expand those empires. Hence, the creation of the UN list of non-self-governing territories to be decolonized, and that was the start of the decolonization process. The first list of those non-self-governing territories to be decolonized by the UN was established in December 14th, 1946. And the French establishments in Oceania, which were mainly what's called now New Caledonia, Wallis and Futuna, and now French Polynesia, were on that initial list of non-self-governing territories to be decolonized. The next episode in our journey is the referendum that was held in all the French Republic and its dependencies in September 1958 for the adoption of the new constitution that would be leading to the Fifth Republic in France. That referendum that was a clear win for France in Tahiti, with almost 80% of the vote being a yes, is very often used by the French Republic to say that even at that time, and that was, they consider it as a self-determination act, the people of French Polynesia decided to remain French. But we have to remind ourselves that at the time in 1958, the majority of the Tahitian people were not very fluent in the French language. And the question that was asked, first of all, was written only in French, and the only political parties that had access to the media and to propaganda were the pro-French political parties. The only opposing party to that referendum was a guy named Povana Opa, and he's now considered as the father figure of Tahitian nationalism. Povana Opa, at the time, he went to war during World War II, and he was somehow admiring this, very, I would say, imposing figure of Charles de Gaulle, General de Gaulle. So even during his campaign, while he was campaigning for a no to the referendum, he was at the same time proclaiming Vive de Gaulle. But so he was the only one at the time to oppose the French referendum. But keep in mind that he didn't have access to any media, to any, I would say, propaganda. He had very limited resources, whereas the pro-French party were helped by the French state, by the French governor at the time. And of course, the question was not really, do you want to remain French or to become independent at the time? The question that was asked was, do you agree with the new constitution for the French Republic? The next episode on our journey takes place totally out of French Polynesia, a little before the referendum, the 1958 referendum, and after that referendum. It takes place in Algeria. Algeria is then also a French colony, and in 1954, their fight for independence and the war for the freedom of Algeria begins. At the same time, and after World War II, there was this quest by the superpowers, started by the United States, then Russia, and all the others, to obtain the nuclear power. And at the time, France and General de Gaulle had established that they needed absolutely to become a nuclear power, and hence they needed to do testing somewhere. And they decided to start their testing in the Sahara Desert of Algeria. And those tests started in Algeria in 1960. But at the time they begin testing in Algeria, they also get a sense in the 1955, 1956, that they might not be able to continue the testings if Algeria gains independence. The link between what's happening at the time in Algeria from 1954 to 1960, where the French nuclear tests start in the Sahara Desert, and our journey might not be obvious. But it is now established that somewhere in 1956, the French already start to search for a plan B in case Algeria gains its independence. They send scouts all over France, in Corsica, in Bretagne, in other parts of mainland France. They also send those military scouts overseas, and some of them end up here in French Polynesia. And we kind of tick all the boxes. We are far from everything, not very populated, not informed of what goes around with nuclear tests, and not very accessible to the international press. So it is now established by historians that in 1957, 1 year before the 1958 referendum, the French had already decided the plan B for the nuclear test in case Algeria gains independence was going to be Tahiti. In that context, when the referendum, the 1958 referendum, occurs, and Povana, who was at the time a member of the French Parliament, what we call a député, opposes the referendum, he's perceived, and also because of what the messages he's sending to the population, he's perceived as a threat to the nuclear tests. The link is not very well established, but it's not very easy to link the dots. A little bit after the referendum, there is some kind of turmoil that happens in the city of Papeete, and Povana Opa is accused of being a terrorist that wanted to burn the city. It was, of course, a farce of a trial, and he was sent to exile. That was, I would say, the grand opening for the nuclear test to happen without any disturbance. So it was very important for the French people, and General de Gaulle made it clear in some messages while Povana was exiled to France that it was important that he could not return to French Polynesia because they needed the French nuclear test to start in French Polynesia right away. With Povana Opa exiled and far away from Tahiti, the path is now clear for the French nuclear tests. The installation of the French Center of Experimentation here, the CEP, starts in 1963. Just before that, the French decide to build the port, the international port, and the international airport, because it was a much needed logistics elements for the French nuclear tests. So in 1966, on July 2nd, the first nuclear test called Aldebaran, a 28 kilotons bomb, is held over Moruroa. So from 1966 to 1996, it's a total of 193 nuclear tests that were performed by France in French Polynesia. 46 of them being aerial tests, that was in the first phase up to 1974, and the rest, because of all the outrage that was taking place in the Pacific and in the world, was done underground. This brings us to the next episode in our journey, and this is the creation in 1977 of the Tavenehuit Atira o Te Maori, that was founded by Oscar Manutahi Te Maru. Oscar Te Maru at the time was a French civil servant. He was working for customs and had the opportunity a few times to go to Moruroa. And it was there that he saw firsthand what was happening there, and that he started, having questions, having doubts about the official thesis of those clean testing. Very rapidly he made contact with some scientists from all over the world and got the determination that those nuclear tests were a bad thing and that they were not clean. So he started the Tavenehuit Atira both as a pro-independence party and an anti-nuclear party, because at the time there was a very much superimposition of the anti-nuclear fight and the pro-independence fight. Very quickly, Oscar Te Maru was convinced that if he wanted to succeed both in the anti-nuclear quest and in his quest for independence, he couldn't stay on a local or a bilateral level with France. He had to go international and to convince the international community to help us both against the French nuclear tests and for our independence. In 1978, so just 1 year after the creation of the Tavenehuit Atira, you have to remember that at the time he's still a French civil servant, he's still working in the French customs. He has no political mandate, he has no electoral mandate. He decides to go to New York, to the United Nations, and he goes along with our friends from New Caledonia, Kanaki, from the FLNKS, with the first member of the parliament from the Kanak people, Charles Pidgeot, and some other friends from Kanaki. So they all go to New York to go and convince the UN to help them out, both Kanaki and French Polynesia, on their quest to self-determination and independence, and in our case also for the ending of the nuclear tests. This travel to the United Nations and to the UN must have been such an adventure at the time, because we don't realize now we have, I wouldn't say direct flights, but it's very easy to go from Tahiti to New York. But at the time, the traveling was not as easy as it is now. And also, the Kanak people, the FLNKS, they didn't speak any English. And Oscar at the time wasn't as fluent in English as he is now. So they end up in New York, they don't know anyone, they don't have a hotel. They end up in some Baptist church in Harlem because they had a letter of recommendation from the Protestant church here. And that's how they find somewhere to to sleep. And but somehow they managed to get through the UN and to meet with the authorities at the UN. For Oscar, this meeting at the UN, I think at the time the Secretary General was Kurt Wildheim from Austria. And so first the Kanak people talk and explain their quest, and then Oscar comes and explain also his quest for independence, for self-determination, and to end up the nuclear tests. And on that very day, that's when, because if we do a flashback to, creation of the UN, the establishing of the first UN list of non-self-governing territories, the fact that both New Caledonia and French Polynesia were on that list, of course, but no one in our countries knew about that list. No one knew it even existed and that we were on that list. So on that very same day in 1978, both Oscar and the Kanak people learned that first, there existed a list of non-self-governing territories that were to be decolonized by the UN. Second, that both New Caledonia and French Polynesia were on that list. And third, we are in 78, that we were delisted upon request, unilateral request from France to re-edit the list, to republish the list in 1963. 1963, the very year the French Nuclear Experiment Center is established in our country. So when Oscar Temaru comes back to Tahiti after that 1978 meeting at the UN, where he realizes that the UN couldn't do anything about the French nuclear tests in our country because we were delisted from the UN list of non-self-governing territories, he's a little bit angry. And he's now thinking that he will dedicate a lot of his energy to have us back on that list. Flash forward 35 years later, that's how long it took Oscar Temaru, and it shows you the determination of our leader. 35 years later, in May 17, 2013, at last, we succeeded after 3 years of lobbying, after 3 years of visiting and explaining our situation to ambassadors, to permanent representatives at the UN, to writing hundreds and hundreds of letters, going to conferences, touring the Pacific, gathering support from the region, first from the PCC, the Pacific Council of Churches, and the World Council of Churches in Pula, Samoa, then convincing the the Polynesian Leaders Group in Rarotonga also to support our quest, and then having the forum, the Pacific Forum support. That's how basically we gained momentum, and at some point Oscar achieved to convince the NAM movement, which is one of the most prominent groups in the UN, to support also our resolution for being back on the list. And that happened on that, I would say, blessed day of May 17, 2013. So where do all these episodes in our journey put us nowadays? Since May 17, 2013, we are back on the UN list of non-self-governing territories to be decolonized. It was, I would say, not well accepted, so to speak, by the French. At the time, they considered it a blatant interference of the UN in internal affairs. And following that, for 10 years, there was this, I would say, schizophrenic denial from France of our reinscription at the UN. Let me explain. The French have, since the 1980s, already had one of its former colonies back on that list, and it was New Caledonia. And so some years after, in 2013, within the same political framework, using only democratic and legal means, Oscar Temaru achieved to have us back on that list also. From the day we were back on the list, and then for 10 years, whenever the item of French Polynesia was tabled at the UN, the French permanent representative would leave the room and he would only come back after. So you had a very paradoxical position from France, where they would stay to listen and to respond to the statements made by the representatives from New Caledonia, Kanaki, but not for us. They were still, I would say, stuck in their denial stance towards our inscription. But to us, it was very important to play by the rules of international law. Since the creation of the Taveni Huiratira Oteo Maori political party by Oscar Temaru, our statute very specifically stipulates that we don't want to attain independence through violence. We want to achieve it through democratic and legal ways. So we put ourselves under I would say, within the framework of international law at the UN, because we consider that the bilateral discussion between France and us is by nature totally asymmetrical in terms of the balance of power. So discussing, only in a bilateral way between France and us would be a totally biased process. So that's why Oscar Temaru was so persistent in wanting us back on that UN list. But we have to realize that 10 years of being ignored by the French is a long time. So in the recent years, I would say in the recent 2 or 3 years, there is this idea that somehow emerged in some parts of our political party, that maybe France will never want to play by international law, and we have to somehow get out of the framework of the UN, and maybe, as some countries like Kosovo or others did at the time, go the way of self-proclamation. The main line of the political party Taveni Huiratira still believes that we have to stick by the rules and play by the book. And it has to be noted that last year there was some progress at the UN. For the first time since our reinscription, the permanent representative of France at the UN stayed during at least my speech as president of French Polynesia, and made an answer to it when the item of French Polynesia was tabled. So that, I consider it, that was the first step towards the dialogue that we are expecting, and that was put in our reinscription resolution. So what's left for us on our journey to self-determination? First of all, let's reiterate that we didn't go to the UN and we didn't lobby from 2011 to 2013 to ask the UN to declare our independence. No. We wanted the UN to put us back on the UN list of non-self-governing territories to be able to engage in a self-determination process. And that implies that we establish a dialogue under, I would say, the scrutiny of the UN in a non-bilateral but in a multilateral fashion to engage the dialogue with our administering power, with France, to establish the self-determination process that we want to establish. There has been one put into place in New Caledonia. It was the result of some violence that took place in the 80s. It was also, I would say, monitored by the UN. So that was the process that they chose with those 3 referendums, even though we don't consider, and the Kanak people don't consider the 3rd referendum that took place in New Caledonia as a valid one, because the Kanak people didn't participate in that referendum. But that does not mean that we necessarily want to have exactly the same process as New Caledonia. The second point that we have to make very clear here is that, when you talk about self-determination, you have several options. You can choose to remain in the same statute that you are now. You can choose to be fully integrated to the administering power. To us, that would mean becoming no longer a French collectivity, but to become a French département d'outre-mer. Then, I would say, suppressing our local institutions, because we currently have a local assembly that doesn't vote laws, but votes regulations, and also that would basically suppress my job as a president, because it would suppress the local government. So that would be the second option, the full integration to the administering power. Third option would be becoming independent, and there is this fourth option that's called sui generis, that would basically mean to establish a new statute of cooperation between us and France. If we look at some other countries, and we have been closely looking at them for many years, for example, the Cook Islands, Rarotonga, you can see that independence nowadays is not necessarily what independence was in the 60s. We are now, I would say, exercising a statute of so-called autonomy with a local assembly, with a local government. I'm the president of the government. I have ministers, I have a government. We have a set number of competencies that we manage, and the French state still retains some of the major competencies, like foreign affairs, like the currency, the justice, police, army. But if you look at Rarotonga, they have this statute of associated state with New Zealand. So our way, the end of the journey to self-determination, of course, depends on the will of the Polynesian people. That's the very basis. It has to remain a democratic process. So we have to set up the path. For that, we have to establish the dialogue with the French state, with our administering power, under the auspices of the UN. And when the Self-Determination Act will happen, then the people of now French Polynesia, hopefully someday Maohinui, will decide which way they want to go. So hopefully this year in October, when we will go to the fourth commission, we'll see again some progress, and that's a request that I'm making to President Macron and to his Minister of Foreign Affairs. We still don't have a set government as we speak in France, but as soon as the new government in France will be announced, I will send a request to President Macron, to Prime Minister, and to the new Minister of Foreign Affairs to enable us at the next fourth commission, where we will travel from October 7th to 11th, to start to take that second step towards the dialogue that needs to be set for us to go forward on our path to self-determination. Thank you for listening. Thiago foi rei.
Well, I'm sure you would all agree. Fascinating insight into what's happening in French Polynesia. A lot of parallels between French Polynesia and what it's attempting to do, and New Caledonia and Bougainville and Cook Islands, and so there's a remarkable spread of self-determination processes happening in the region, something to be watched carefully. So we're very grateful for the President for putting that effort in, and as you'll see, he really, as you saw, he really is a bit of a geek. If he put all that together himself, all of those images set side by side. We've got to move on to listen to two other geeks. Colin Wiltshire and Thiago Oppermann. And we're going to discuss methodological advances in Melanesian election analysis. But in fact, it's a bit more than that. Back in about 2007 election in Papua New Guinea, Nicole Haley, not long finished her PhD, a lot of experience in the western part of the highlands of Papua New Guinea, put together a program for doing observation of that national election. And she was frustrated that observation processes tend to focus on the day of the voting and the day of the counting, or the days in Papua New Guinea, but not on what happens before, in between, and after. And it tends to be focused on just a few places, and it's undertaken by people from outside who have absolutely no idea of the local culture, politics, economics, etc. And so their ability to actually assess whether it's a free and fair election is very limited. So she put together an idea for doing much more detailed observation over an extended period, involving trained people from the area who spoke the language and understood what was happening. She subsequently helped put together with the NRI in Papua New Guinea observation in not just 2007, but 2012, 2017 and 2022. In the process, expanding the work that was done, but gradually, over time, in the Department of Pacific Affairs, we've realised that between them, Nicole and now Thiago and Colin, have developed a whole new methodology for not just observing elections, but for analysing what's happening in elections and trends in elections over time, a sort of longitudinal research effort. It's particularly important in Papua New Guinea, but not just in Papua New Guinea, but other parts of Melanesia, because it's helping us to understand the very different ways in which elections operate in different parts of the country, driven by culture and language and local personalities and so on. But when you do it longitudinally, it's even richer because you start to see the trends between 2007, 12, 17 and 22. So if you're looking at something like violence at polling booths, you can see not only the huge differences across the country, but you can see huge differences from one election to another. Same with the involvement of women. You can go on and on and on. So this, it seems to us in the Department of Pacific Affairs, is something of a breakthrough in a methodology for understanding what's happening in a country as complex as Papua New Guinea, where political parties and policy debates are not what determines what goes on in elections. And most of the observers that come in, very good neutral observers, tend to assume that Papua New Guinea operates on a sort of party system, a policy debate basis. It doesn't, and Solomon Islands doesn't, and many countries in Africa don't, and many countries in Asia don't. So it seems to us that what our staff have done is develop a new methodology that is going to be of great use way beyond Melanesia, in other parts of the world, and not just for elections. It could be a methodology that's usable to study a lot of other things in countries of this kind. It's a real mix, as you will hear, of both quantitative and qualitative methodology, where the qualitative helps us to understand what's happening with the quantitative, measurable things. So I'm going to hand straight over to Colin and Thiago. Colin is a former public servant in AusAid who got involved in doing AusAid work in Papua New Guinea, particularly on the delivery of services, and has continued to focus more and more on that area of work in his academic study. Thiago is an anthropologist who did his PhD in the Hahalis area of Buka in Papua New Guinea, but he's also a geek and has got deeply into, as you will see, deeply into highly technical areas of research that make absolutely no sense to me until I see the pictures. So you wait and see. Thank you, Colin. Thiago.
Okay, good morning all, and thank you, Anthony, for the introduction. So my presentation will focus on assessing electoral trends in Solomon Islands based on the elections research we did in 2019 and again earlier this year. So after an election takes place, particularly in Melanesia, there are often three main questions that audiences want to know. First, we want to know if the election was fair and credible, such as were citizens even able to vote, which can't simply be assumed based on what Thiago will present for the PNG context. But if most citizens did vote, were they afforded a secret ballot, and were they able to do so free from intimidation? The second aspect of an election that audiences usually want to know about is what aspects are getting better and what's actually getting worse in electoral practices and processes. And this does not only apply to electoral administration, but also to understanding changes in electoral politics, such as what are the key factors that influence voter decision-making, or what schemes have politicians adopted to get themselves re-elected. Third, in countries like PNG and Solomon Islands, electoral reforms are common and constant. Audiences want to know whether or not these reforms could be considered a success. And this requires careful assessment with a distinct benefit of what we do for election observation research. So to provide answers into these kinds of questions, it's necessary to develop a fit-for-purpose research approach in the context of elections. And now, two formative principles normally associated with any research project requires consideration, and that is about the breadth and depth of the data collection exercise. Breadth and coverage are important because our area of interest is a national election. Practically, this means how many electorates in the country can we realistically cover? While it might be terrific to cover every electorate in a country, it's just not realistic, and indeed it's probably problematic, because intuitively, the larger your research teams are, the more that can go wrong during fieldwork. So adopting an appropriate sampling strategy is therefore essential. The second principle that requires careful consideration is depth, particularly the specific topics that should be covered through elections research. And our election observations have developed more into understanding the state of democracy in PNG and Solomon Islands, rather than simply observing electoral processes, but they certainly haven't been lost over time. But with a broader remit, it's really crucial to make hard decisions about the depth of data we can gather on any one aspect of an election or the state of democracy. So the rest of this presentation will focus on methods for how the principles I've just outlined are applied to elections research. I'll briefly step you through the research design, the collaborations established, and the practicalities for conducting fieldwork in the 2024 Solomon Islands national elections. That has produced one of the largest and most detailed comparative data sets for the country since independence. And I'll finish by giving you a bit of a taster of some emerging findings based on our analysis conducted to date. So in terms of what our objectives were, we had three. The first was to deepen our understanding of electoral behaviour. We also wanted to provide an impartial and accurate assessment of the national elections. But thirdly, we wanted to assess electoral trends over time by replicating the methods used in 2019. And now our observation research is very different from other election observation missions, particularly like the Commonwealth Secretariat and the United Nations. We really use deep field-based methods with longer time frames for fieldwork. And we also have these detailed citizen surveys in the pre-polling period and the post-polling period. Now, elections took place on the 17th of April this year in 50 constituencies and more than 1,000 polling stations. And there was significant international interest that saw more than double the number of observer missions compared to 2019. It was also unique in that it was the first time national and provincial elections were held at the same time on the same day. For DPA, we partnered with Sinew to conduct these joint elections. And this was really a team-based approach amongst our academic and professional staff. For Sinew, I can see Leonora here today and Lindsay is somewhere, I'm sure. At the ANU, we had Stephanie, Annie, James, Thiago, Karen and myself. And so this created a really collaborative research approach from the start of the research project all the way through to analysis that we're still undertaking. So our research methods can be broken down into 4 distinct phases. Firstly, you have to decide on the electorates you want to research. And you can see in this map the purple shades of the 15 constituencies out of 50 that we went to. Then you have to decide on where research teams will go within those constituencies. Thirdly, you have to develop research instruments and train observers on the research approach. And finally, you have to ensure consistency of field work across the country, especially the conduct at field work sites. Now, we aim to collect data that was representative of the constituency populations, which presents numerous challenges. So the size of the constituency, especially its population and geography, that determined where teams would travel, because we were trying to get back to the same polling station locations sampled in 2019 to ensure accurate comparison. So it's 148 separate field sites across the country. And the way we did this is that we split the urban teams. They had 12 polling stations they needed to access, whereas the rural or remote teams, they had 8 polling stations to sample because it was simply harder to get around in those constituencies. And the typical had 10. And so you can see at the bottom there that we're therefore aiming to conduct about 2,700 face-to-face administered surveys before the election and then do the same after the election. Now here's an example of how we sample at polling stations within constituencies. So this is Small Malaita province here, and you can see on the screen that the total number of registered voters is 8,053. So what we do is we stratify the list of polling stations by ward in alphabetical order, and we divide our total sample 8 by the total number of registered voters, which gives us an interval. And so that's how you can see that the sampling we did, we started in Hokesia and went to Malakau. And so what this does, it gives every registered voter an even chance of selection, making our data representative. And so this is what it looks like on the map. You can see the pink dots where the survey teams went from the 25 polling station locations in Small Malaita. You can see that's a pretty good distribution when you just from the eye test. Now for Galbagatu constituency, the purple dots are the 8 sampled locations. And I just want to show you how we actually do this research. So this team would start in Putukora, and they sample 8 women and 8 men per polling station. Then the team travels the length of the constituency, as you can see here, and this all happens before polling day occurs. Then when polling day happens, the team split to view individual polling places, and there's normally about 5 or 6 team members. That's why we can't cover every station. Then after the election, they go back for these post-polling surveys. And so what we did in 2019 is we followed the exact same approach, but we increased the sample. So that's why you can see in 2024, we have a larger sample than in 2019. So this research design is what you might call a repeated cross-sectional survey. And that involves the repeated administration of the same questions to a sample from the same survey population. And these have often been used in political science all the way back to since the 1940s, and it's used especially in polls to track public opinion during campaign periods. And it's been argued that these studies allow us to track trends and establish causal inferences. Now, it's important to note that longitudinal panel surveys are often different from repeated cross-sectional data. So our survey represents a new sample drawn from the same population at 2 points in time, 2019, 2024. And that's different to panel surveys where the same individuals are interviewed in a certain population. And panel surveys would probably be impossible to conduct in Solomon Islands, and they have many drawbacks, so you probably wouldn't want to do it anyway. And that includes the cost of tracking citizens, priming amongst respondents, and avoiding attrition of people falling out of the survey. And since there's no public polling on political attitudes in Solomon Islands, we hope this sample can be maintained over time. Because it doesn't only enable the whole data set to be viewed, we can also do trend and change analysis at constituency, ward, and even community levels. Now, our survey topics covered were very diverse and broad. So we, all the way from voter registration processes to perceptions of federalism in Solomon Islands. I've just given you a sample here of the questions we asked from the pre-polling survey on perceptions of women candidates. So the red dots are the repeated questions from 2019, and the blue dots is what we've added. So do you think there should be more women MPs? Are there any good women candidates contesting this constituency? Would you ever vote for a woman candidate? They're the repeated. And then we added questions this time, such as what qualities would you look for in a woman candidate? Are they the same qualities you look for in a male candidate, and why? So you can see that we've got a mixture of quantitative and qualitative research. And also what was added for 2024 were perceptions of geopolitics in Solomon Islands. Questions like thinking about the nation, which donor countries should support Solomon Islands, how positive or negative is the influence of the following countries on Solomon Islands, and then which of those countries has the most influence on Solomon Islands political processes, and does that influence concern the citizen? Now, before we could go to the field, we had to conduct observer training on the research instruments. And so each of our observers are given this enormous journal. This is called their Bible, and they have to put this under their pillow when they slept at night. And so it covers the pre-polling, polling day, and post-polling periods. And so our training runs through the protocols, we do simulations, and we also do translation of the journal. And now each team spent more than 3 weeks full-time in the field, and this required long boat rides and even hiking to access remote locations. And at each field site, we provided guidance so we were consistent. They had to gain consent from community leaders or chief, informing them about the research. And then they had to talk to local populations about where the voting population was. So in total, we conducted 5,342 citizen surveys, all face-to-face, administered with citizens across Solomon Islands. And that equates to about 200,000 data points. And we have a balance of men, women, age groups, and those with disabilities. Then the observers also provided responses to about another 400 questions, which is about 32,000 data points. So it really is a significant data set. And then 2 weeks after the election was over, we were able to finalise that data set because the entry was done in the field on tablets, and it was approved by team leaders so they could do checks and balances. Then the data monitoring, checking for errors and cleaning took place on a daily basis by the ANU and CNU staff. And we're very lucky that the ACFO Foundation was supporting us with monitoring dashboards so we could see the data updating on a daily basis. This then allowed us to have a debrief session when all teams returned, not just to discuss the data, but to discuss the actual results that we could see on our dashboards. A week after that process, we were able to provide a formal briefing to the Solomon Islands Electoral Commission board members and also DFAT as the funding provider, almost immediately after the election was finished. And by early June 24, we were able to produce a preliminary findings report for the SIC to consider. Okay, so now I just want to provide some emerging findings from the analysis conducted to date. So these are the 8 key findings that you can see on the screen. The first 4 are fairly positive. The next 4 are what we might say are challenges. But I'll just focus on the blue due to time. So one of the main findings we're looking at is that citizen support for female candidates seems to have increased since 2019 based on our data. So you can see the overall finding here. When citizens, we asked them, do they think there should be more women MPs? There was an increase of 6%. And then, would you be willing to vote for a woman candidate? For the whole sample, increased from 51% to 69% from 2019 to 2024. And just giving you an example of one of the MPs who was elected, this is the Honourable Kathy Norrie, who was elected for Meringue-Kokoda. And you can see in the findings here, when we look at the sample just for Meringue-Kokoda, citizens' perspectives on a good woman candidate. She contested in 2019. 52% said they thought there was a good woman candidate compared to 82% when we went back there in 2024. Also in 2019, 47% of citizens said they'd vote for a female candidate, which increased to 63% for 2024. So there does seem to be some correspondence between what voters were telling us and the actual election of Kathy Norrie. Then we had these more detailed questions about desirable qualities citizens look for in a woman candidate. And now these really can't be easily summarised. But in general, the largest proportion of citizens talked about character integrity, empathy, well-educated, good leadership skills, and approachable. And you can see that responses range from incredibly broad. Let's give you 2 examples here. One woman in East Honiara said, a woman who has good educational background, is of good character, is honest and empathetic. She's able to be vocal about passing laws in Parliament. So that's her perspective. And then another in East Guadalcanal, a more rural constituency, she said, if she can help me with building materials, piggery fence, and someone who can easily approach for help when I'm in need, that is what I'm looking for in a candidate. So it's not so easy just to automatically be able to quantify a lot of these qualitative responses. So just to finish up, I'll give you one of the more challenging concerns from the election, and it's that cross-border registration is more prominent and more of a concern for citizens. So this is a real example where electoral systems can undermine trust and faith citizens have in them. And this is how voters register through the registration process. And it's been colloquially known as cross-border registration. And our 2019 report showed that this was taking place. And it happens because candidates offer incentives such as an immediate future benefit or gifts to citizens, but it also goes the other way. Citizens also approach candidates offering to vote in their constituency if they do receive something. And so these political economy factors definitely can influence results of an election. And now the SIEC as a reform tried to put in measures to stop this process taking place. So they didn't allow for out-of-constituency registrations, voters had to be physically present, and they needed proof of their identity or local witness. So we wanted to see if this reform actually resolved the issue. But based on the data collected, we can see that SIEC efforts essentially failed to curb cross-border registration. And we'd say, in fact, that they've accelerated. And one of the key points that you can see on screen is the inconsistent growth in voter registrations between 2019 and 2024. So the national average saw 25% growth in the voter roll in 2019 and then 17% in 2024. But look at the enormous variation amongst the constituencies that can't be explained just through citizens turning 19. So we wanted to look at what were the issues going on here. So 44% of citizens in our pre-polling survey, they said they knew someone who had registered in their constituency even though they lived in another location. And it was across the country, ranging from 62% in North Vella to 32% in Central Makira. And then we asked people what were they given or what were they offered if they wanted to cross border. And a couple of examples here. The last one says, the MP in my previous constituency failed me. Now I was promised again by our candidate here with building materials in this constituency as one of the reasons that people chose to cross border. And then we had this new question asking citizens, when is it fair for people living outside your constituency to register here? And responses ranged enormously from citizens who said they think they should be able to decide where to vote, to citizens who said they should never be able to be allowed to take place. And then after the election, we asked citizens, was cross-border voting problematic? Was it an issue for your constituency? And overall, more citizens, 47%, said yes, it was a concern, than those who stated no. So this attests to the widespreadness of the problem. And I'll give you just an example here from Elki Langalanga, because you can see here that almost 3/4 of their respondents said it was an issue. So they were quite strong, respondents in Elki Langalanga. One person said that the problem is more than big. The percentage of cross-border voters is much higher than the residential population in this constituency. While another citizen said that it also causes social problems like the abuse of girls and other family problems. Citizens also use really strong language in expressing their grievances, such as it is a threat to our people and they're giving power to our MP. Others said, this is taking away our rights. These entitlements are rightfully ours, not theirs, because we are the Indigenous people from here and our entitlements are being shifted away. And now one of the consequences of cross-border registration is that we're seeing declining confidence in the electoral roll in Solomon Islands. So in 2019, 58% of citizens said the electoral roll they thought was accurate. Now it's less than half. And the key reason they gave was that cross-border registrations is one of the main reasons that we don't see our electoral roll to be accurate. Okay, so in conclusion, these research methods, they really enable us to have a better understanding of what is improving and what is getting worse in terms of trends over time. And they also enable us to drill down into the constituency level. And I'd say that it's not so much an advance in research methods, but it's more of a realisation that repeating the study provides probably more benefits than drawbacks. There's much more analysis to come from the CNU and ANU team, and look forward to working with colleagues in the future. So thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Thiago Oppermann. I will have to, I think, rush a little bit through this presentation. We have some substantial differences between the PNG study and the Solomon study. The PNG study is considerably larger and has a somewhat different strategy for entering the research areas. I will try to describe the slides as well. So the opening slide is a picture of Wayuma in Gumini district, Chimbu, quite a beautiful mountain. Just a very quick overview of what I'll be talking about, and I apologize for rushing through it. First, I'll give a very brief explanation of how we did this. Then I will pick two areas, two results essentially that I find particularly important. They are important to me. There are many, many, many different results that come out of a study as large as this, covering a very wide range of topics in the election. But I find that these two speak to me as an anthropologist who has an interest in how to do studies that gather together a very large number of very small ethnographies, which is essentially what I see the observers as doing. And finally, we'll have some time for discussions. Hang on a second. So unlike the Solomon Islands project, we don't sample randomly in PNG, and that's for a number of different reasons. But probably the most important one is that we work a lot in the highlands area and in areas with very severe logistic and security concerns. And we need to develop a strategy for reaching people that is sensible in terms of how safe it is for our workers, and also one that is able to have some sort of interaction with the structures of social structures that are relevant in specific areas. PNG is an enormously diverse area, and it can be very difficult to know from observing it from a map where those diversities matter. Okay, so what we do instead is that we pick observers who are each able to bring their own perspective into the study. They each pick at the social fabric at a different thread. And once we have enough observers at a very large scale, we've got a fairly, an ersatz representativity, or fake representativity. And at a smaller scale, we are able to see particular angles into what's happening in PNG that are quite significant. For instance, we had in 2022 several observer teams that were specifically composed of disabled and mobility challenged people who could give us a unique perspective in that. Of course, that creates a lot of, this is not a sampling strategy that I would recommend, but it does have, in general, but it does have some important advantages. And it produces data that is, I think, quite useful. And it's especially useful because the observers are overwhelmingly locals with strong connections to their communities. We're able to ask questions that are quite sensitive. And we collect enough of these surveys that we get some quite, I think, quite remarkable data. One of the areas that we are particularly interested in for, just briefly, where we work in PNG. So we are, in fact, able to cover the majority of PNG's provinces. And in each one of them, we have at least 100 respondents in our smaller survey. Inside these provinces, we look at 64 different districts, and that's about 2/3 of the total number of districts to look at. You'll notice that I'm speaking of districts and not electorates. There's a whole other lecture on why we can't talk about electorates, but that's for another time. We cover a whole wide range of issues. Just as in the Solomon Islands, the studies are very similar in terms of content. And one area that I think is particularly important is the issue of transactional politics or money politics. This is an issue that has bugged me for a long time. Because I'm an anthropologist and I read a lot of ethnographies, I've always had a perspective of this on money politics that is perhaps more charitable to how exchange works in communities to affect political organization. And I wanted to see, using the data that we have, are we able to sort of try to understand how this works? And what we were able to do this time is collect, about 2,300 of these people who told us how much money they had been given in exchange for their vote. And what we find is that there is a significant inequality in the amounts that they tell us. And not just that, but we collect that information twice, before and after the election. And what we find is that before the election, there is more inequality in the distribution, and then there is less inequality, slightly less, afterwards, which is what you would expect as large donors begin to distribute their money around. So over time, that money finds its way in smaller and smaller amounts around the place. I think it's quite a strong result in the sense that it gives you a sense that overwhelmingly people who receive money for their vote in PNG receive fairly small amounts of money. And then we can start asking, well, does this affect people? But if you have, if you look at the total amount of money that is floating around, we collected, 1,300,000 before the election and about 900,000 afterwards. This total amount of money that we captured in the research is roughly equivalent to what we estimate like the cost of one campaign in a hot electorate is like. So the amount of money that we guesstimate is floating around in elections in PNG is extremely large. And if it follows roughly the distribution that we find, it is quite strongly concentrated. We can use this distribution inside our non-random sample to try to understand how it affects different aspects of people's attitudes and other aspects of voting. So for instance, we can cut that distribution up like this and then see if it affects, for instance, does someone who get a bribe to vote for someone, well, do they vote at all? We find that overall, about 20% of people who get money to vote don't vote. That this effect, that's quite strongly concentrated in the highlands, because in the highlands there is a much lower number of people who say they vote, about 64%, whereas outside the highlands, the turnout, as seen from our survey, is much higher, although that's the opposite of what the actual turnout is. So we can use these methods in a sort of Bayesian environment to try to work out roughly just how strong that effect is. And what we find is that you have to get a monster gift for it to have a strong effect on your chances to vote. We can also see, and this is where the anthropologist in me starts getting excited, we ask people, does receiving a gift mean that you are indebted and have to vote for that person? And we find that, yes, getting a gift does increase your probability of saying yes to that question. And getting a monster gift increases it quite a bit. Overall, the effect of the gift is stronger outside the highlands, because inside the highlands, people in general think that that spirit of the gift is already there, even if they don't get one, right? However, there's an interesting twist to this, because we also ask people whether when they voted, their motivation to vote was, what made them vote the way they did? And we asked them, well, was it obligation? And it turns out that getting a gift does nothing to your odds of saying that you were obliged to vote for it. So on the one hand, it's strongly associated with this attitude that you should reciprocate, but it doesn't seem to actually, at least as far as our respondents tell us, change the reasons you vote. So there's a little mystery for you. We can also probe something that's quite interesting, which is we ask people whether they got gifts in kind as well as cash gifts. And there's quite a strong difference between different kinds of gift and their association with the size of the cash gift. So things like funerals and school fees are very strongly associated with the size of the cash gift. Whereas things like capital goods, building materials, produce and trucks are just sort of mildly, by the time you put this through a proper regression, those things probably disappear. But what we see here essentially is that what's happening, I think the most parsimonious explanation is that the funeral is the cash gift, right? So that's what we are capturing. And that's quite interesting from the perspective of trying to understand the systems of exchange that happen as the articulation of politics in PNG. People are not just buying a vote, they are giving the vote in the context of a funeral. It's something that has got a particular articulation. We find, quite surprisingly, that these categories of gifts in kind, betel nut, food, livestock, and phone credit, have basically no relationship to the size of the cash gift the person tells us about. And that's particularly surprising with livestock, pigs being like, the gift as far as the New Guinea Highlands anthropology literature goes. And they're quite expensive, right? A gift, a pig probably costs more than the median gift that we collected. So the lack of relationship here is quite interesting. And it points towards there being different contexts of exchange. And the reason I find this particularly exciting is that it is bridging a macro picture of the political economy of Papua New Guinea with that rich description that comes from ethnographic accounts of exchange. So here is, that's just for the survey side. Here's a nice picture of a tree. I love putting these in my surveys. And I think the reason I like putting them in is that they are really complex and suggest diversity, but not the kind of annoying diversity that people like bringing up in PNG studies, where, PNG, it's so diverse, so we don't have to think about it. So, let's look at the polling day side. Okay, so we have, over the last 3 elections, systematically collected data for polling days, polling stations. Now, this data was, I think, people did not understand just how rich it was, I think, until we started to enter this systematically and interpret it geographically. So I took this data and I projected it into a map. And we get some quite interesting patterns. There's a whole lot of information about polling day stuff, and Colin mentioned before that as the study developed from 2007 onwards, we've tended to be more interested in the sort of richer picture of how politics works, things such as the money politics stuff that I just talked about. However, I think that by looking at this polling day material, I've become quite convinced that you can tell a lot about what's happening in PNG from very small details of polling. We have all these different categories of information. This absurdly large instrument here has like 160 questions for polling day, but there's a few of them that are really important, because they relate to the voting process, like how do you get ballots filled, right? So that's what I call a voting method. It's a misnomer because we include in voting methods such things as, hijacking a ballot box or destroying a polling station. We can talk about, is that a voting method at all? But we can classify these with a modicum of insanity into these 6 different voting methods. An orderly voting method is a kind of semi-compliant one. It's one where the voter initiates the process. There is voter identification, an individual's vote. Not all polling stations in this category would be running along the laws of PNG elections. Many of them would have many serious shortcomings. But only polling stations in this VM1 class can, in principle, be kosher. The number 2 ones, we have the roll call stations. These are ones where instead of the voter initiating the process, they are called to vote. That seems like a small change, but has important repercussions for the power dynamics on the day. Coming to our voter method number 3, that's a no ID individual stations. These are stations in which there is the generate voter ID, and that can be panels of people screening who gets to vote or not, but still individuals voting. Further down the ladder, we've got non-individual stations. These are ones in which ballots are handled in bulk and given to family heads to vote. Then we have voter method 5. These are stations that have been either very, very severely disrupted or have been monopolized, so only a few people vote. And then we have collapsed polling stations in which the whole thing has basically stopped or the boxes disappeared or something like that. Okay, we can take this and we can classify the polling stations and produce them up like this. On the right, we can see the distribution of this in space, and then on the left, we've got the sort of proportions per province, right? And what we can see, very obviously, there is a dramatic difference between the highlands area and everywhere else. Those very severely non-compliant polling methods are only found there. This is pretty much the raw data, so there are some misclassifications, and some of the very severe outcomes outside the highlands are probably misclassifications. We find that roll call methods are geographically distributed in an interesting way. They're found in Momase area, Morobe, Madang, East Sepik, New Ireland, West New Britain, but they're not so common elsewhere. We also find the NCD is quite different from its surrounding provinces. The NCD has many more stations that fall in that no ID individual category. But what we find that is, I think, especially interesting here, no one would have been surprised by this, viewed from the moon, but if we zoom in, we start seeing that there is actually a great deal of heterogeneity in the distribution of voting methods. So inside the highlands, we have got very different outcomes for polling stations that might only be a kilometer, 200 meters, or even adjacent to another one. What happens to your rights as a voter changes dramatically with where you vote in the highlands. And there are some really important associations that happen here. When we start looking at this in more detail, we find that where there is sort of some vestigial roll use in the highlands, it's often near elite institutions, elite residences, schools, police stations, hospitals. We find that in greater detail, these severely non-compliant polling stations where no one's getting to vote, elite voters are sometimes allowed to vote individually in a context where most people aren't. So there is a great deal of inequality in outcomes with what happens inside the highlands. Because I'm completely crazy, I sat down and I took the 2017 data and entered all of that, and we can see the change over time of that. So what is quite remarkable here is that in 2017, especially in the eastern end of the highlands, so that's Chimbu province and eastern highlands, there were a substantial number of these individual but non-roll using stations, and they are gone. They've become much rarer than they were before. Enga province used to be characterized as having a lot of these family-level group votes. So, I give you a huge pile of votes and you distribute amongst your household and vote for that. That pattern has become, much less common there. So, this is quite exciting to see, and terrible to see also. Now, voting methods also provide us a really interesting perspective into PNG's implausible turnouts. Now, it's really annoying to get turnout figures for PNG, but eventually last Thursday I got them, and for 2022. And we find that that red vertical line there is 100% turnout, right? Everything to the right of that is in La La Land. But really anything within 5% of that line is not plausible, okay? Well, we find that those, and on the vertical scale, we've basically given and treated that voting method as if it was a number. There are some justifications for doing that, but it's beyond here. And the dotted line shows where the average voting method is within the role, uses the role, right? So it's above that line, doesn't use the role, below that uses the role. And if we look at these districts, we find, quite remarkably, if you are close to the vertical red line, you're probably going to be in one of the more nightmarish voting methods. Whereas if you have a plausible turnout of, let's say 80% or below, overwhelmingly you are in an area with observed roll use. So we get a sense of what's going on with those fantastical turnouts. Now, just briefly before I turn to discussion, when I look at that map, and I'll just bring it up quickly again, when I look at a map like this, and I see this great deal of heterogeneity in space, and it's also there in time, the picture that I have is, the thing that I'm interested in, one of the things I'm interested in, is a metaphor that observers often use for elections, which is that they are hot. And when we think about heat, it's not that everything is at the same level of bustedness. It's rather a distribution. As the election gets hotter, more energy goes into the system. And you get these varying results and heterogeneity that spreads out. And I think that's quite a fascinating thing that we hope to investigate more systematically as we go on. Another aspect of analysis of polling day, these really mechanical aspects of polling day, is that we end up asking some questions that really belong in a philosophy seminar. Is hijacking and destroying a polling station, is that an electoral strategy? When people vote in a group context, is that voting? Is there, like a real question, is there a dimension of representation of some sort if armed factions that do all of that have to swim amongst the people to be able to operate? Okay, so there's some questions there that are really, really deep. And we have the ability to explore those empirically. I think that's quite a strong thing. But at the same time, if we are interested in addressing these problems, and I don't want to sound like a vulture sort of feasting on this. This is horrific. It's a very terrible result. If we want to do something about this, then we need to start thinking very deeply about what is going on inside PNG elections. And has very sobering implications for what sorts of, how you solve these issues. So I'll just skip that. In terms of applications of this, Anthony mentioned, well, what could we do this somewhere else? Could we export these methods to other places? And I think on the one hand, we have been able to get this to run, at least to the level that you've seen, in extremely challenging conditions, right? Enga, Southern Highlands, Hela are not easy places to do research. And the range of outcomes that we are dealing with has greater diversity of outcomes than some continents. So our methods are able to span a very great deal of different possibilities. On the other hand, we are leveraging some very important aspects of Papua New Guinean social organization, notably its segmentary structure, so that our observers are able to find the threads of the social fabric to pull on, and that's how we operate. Whether that can be done in other places or there's analogous ways of structuring studies like this in other places, that's another question. But I'll leave it there because I don't want to take up too much time. Okay.
It's already past when you're meant to be having coffee. Shall we take 10 minutes of coffee time, or do you want to go for coffee? Coffee? It's a long time. All right. Well, I think you'll see from what... Karen? 5 minutes? I think the consensus seems to be coffee, just from the people that were putting there. I should say we've not had enough time to present. The richness in the data they have, the richness of the methodological approach is remarkable. As someone interested in Bougainville, for example, the maps that Thiago produces, Bougainville is on an extreme high performance, sticking to the rules. And the further west you go, not only the worse the picture, but the more complicated the picture. There's an amazing mixture. So there's a huge amount of thinking needed to make sense of what it all says. So I think the big thing about this methodology is the richness. I'll stop there. Thank you very much. I hope you found it interesting. And we'll be back at 11.